everyone. This is the Science Fiction, Fantasy, and Science Fantasy panel discussion for the Virtual FantasyCon 2017. And today we're going to be talking about what defines these genres and what makes them different from each other, etc., etc. So lots of philosophical discussion I'm anticipating. Why don't you guys go ahead and introduce yourselves and what you write?
I'm Tom Falwell. I write fantasy, sci-fi, and I'm going to be writing science fiction one of these days for sure. I actually started something, but it ain't gone very far yet.
I'm Amanda Justice. I write science fantasy and occasionally straight science fiction and occasionally straight historical fiction.
I'm Shane Thomas. I write the Anki Legacies Adventures. It's a whole lot of martial arts wrapped around a bit of hard science fiction, space fantasy, and even what we talked about the other night is, I guess, being hard archaeological fantasy set in the Stone Age.
I'm Erin Michael Hall. I write classic epic fantasy with a grimdark edge, and science fantasy and science fantasy romance. So I intermingle all three of those. Hello.
And I'm the host, Sarah Buhrman. I write mostly fantasy, but I also write science fantasy because hard science fiction is just too hard for me. The definition that I have heard and kind of adopted as science fantasy is anything that essentially reads like a science fiction, but the science part isn't very realistic. And the example that I've heard is like the X-Men, where the explanation for the abilities is that they are mutants, but of course that's not how mutations work, so that makes it science fantasy. So what do you guys think of that definition, and have you heard any other definitions of science fantasy?
Well, if I can start, I would flip it around. I think actually that's a fair definition, but it depends on what the core genre is. In my view, science fantasy is something that looks like fantasy on the surface, but presents a scientific rationale for the supernatural events rather than a mystical rationale. And my number one favorite example of how to explain the difference is the movie Avatar. The movie Avatar, if the humans are not there on the planet, that's a fantasy because they have Awa, it's a god, there's mystical powers and there's mystical connections between each of the species. And then Grace from the movie, the head scientist, shows up and she gives her, it's a neural net explanation for why all of the animals and creatures and trees are able to talk to each other. And she presents a scientific explanation for the mystical occurrences that are happening on the planet. And that's why so there's the difference between the science fiction aspect of that movie and the fantasy aspect of that movie. And that's why I would call that movie science fantasy.
Well, I think that just about hit the nail on the head. I in my opinion, science fiction is taking something that's on the cutting edge of technology, or could be on the cutting edge of technology, and building a narrative on where it could go beyond where we currently are. With fantasy, I would say that the sky's the limit, and you don't have to rely so much on an explanation that could lead to the eventual development of that as a tool for mankind.
I think there's going to be as many definitions for science fantasy as there are for fantasy or science fiction. If you put 10 people in the room and ask them all to define one genre over the other, you're going to come up with 10 different answers. There's no solid definition that I can see. It's whatever you want it to be. And that is you, the author, or you, the reader. I look at Star Wars and I say, that's science fantasy. But somebody else say, no, that's science fiction. And someone else may even say it's fantasy. So I think it's really, in this case, the genre is in the eye of the beholder.
I agree. It's almost like all those labels are just where we need to put our books on Amazon shelves in order for somebody to browse against
Yeah.
them. It's all about if your story's a fun story or not.
And unfortunately, there is no category called science fantasy on the Amazon shelves or any other shelves at all, although the term has been around for a really long time. So back in the 1990s, somebody that I was shocked, I had an agent and he called my work, it's science fantasy. And I'd actually never heard of the term before, but I'm like, yeah, actually it is. And so it was nice for me to see that there's been a reemergence of the term as a descriptor, because it's exactly what I feel my work is. And anybody who writes in that same vein, Frank Herbert's work is science fantasy, Star Wars is science fantasy, Anne McCaffrey's work is science, her Pern books are science fantasy. So and those are sort of the people that I've modeled my own efforts after.
I agree with all of that, because for me it's sort of emerging. Of course, to have science fantasy, it has to have some of those futuristic technological aspects, as well as having the fantastical aspects. It doesn't list what fantastical aspects or whatever, that's up to the author. So, but as long as it encompasses both, it falls under that genre, it's science fantasy.
I agree. I never really considered the two as separate until I became interested in writing. As a kid, I would watch Dragon Ball, and they have spaceships, they fly to other planets, but at the same time they summon the magic of their martial arts to have these super powered battles. So it's they're going to the underworld and interacting with demons and then flying to other planets and seeing aliens. So that was from a very young age, there had always been this kind of blend.
Thinking, if you think that way, Flash Gordon was science fantasy.
Oh yeah.
And it was considered hard science fiction when it was around. So, I mean, they considered that was science fiction, Flash Gordon. But if you start thinking about Ming the Emperor, he had strange powers that couldn't be explained by science. So, in that sense, it was science fantasy.
And some people consider anything that has faster than light travel to be science fantasy rather than science fiction, because with our current understanding of the universe, that doesn't faster than light travel does not seem to be something that is possible. But that's not to say that it's not possible. So
Things are only impossible until they're not.
exactly.
Yeah. The Earth was only flat until it became round.
Exactly.
Think about how many technological advances we have now that in 40 years ago were 50 years ago were just imagined. And my favorite example is the flip phone, which back in the old Star Trek, when they had the communicators and they would flip them open, and as kids, we used to think that was the coolest thing ever. And now flip phones are so old hat and outdated. My daughter's at the right age where we're talking about getting her a cell phone, and we're saying, well, we might get you a flip phone, and it's like would be the most embarrassing thing ever.
I hate to show my age, but Dick Tracy had a video wristwatch.
Right? Yeah.
And they got those now.
They got those now. Exactly.
Well, DS9 had the little pad that they used to read books and things. And that was right before the Kindle came out. And seriously, when the Kindle first came out, I was just like, I'm gonna be like that.
I'm glad to meet somebody else that watched the Star Trek that didn't boldly go anywhere.
Really cool characters. I love that series.
Babylon 5. DS9 and Babylon 5 are basically the same show. But I actually like DS9 better. So I'm with you on that.
I just like Murtaugh on it. He was my favorite Klingon. First it was Worf, and then Murtaugh. I love Murtaugh. I got to meet him this year. Oh, sweet fellow.
Oh, awesome.
He's so nice.
Well, we've been kind of touching on a rather interesting topic, which is how these genres change with the times. And sometimes that's influenced by our understanding of science, and sometimes that's influenced by the mainstream's understanding of how science fiction and fantasy blend together.
I think that's true. That's true. I think, from the mainstream perspective, there is still a division in people's minds that if it has any sort of futuristic technology whatsoever, it's science fiction. And if it has any sort of like, if people are wearing old clothes or like old-timey clothes and it's medieval technology or anything remotely like that, then it's fantasy. And it doesn't actually matter what happens in between, but there are a ton of examples of stories that blend the two. So where from Star Wars is definitely the most prominent, because the Jedi's powers are clearly mystical in origin, although there is the explanation that was given in, I think, one of the animated series, that they're like some sort of like microparticles or something that give them their powers. But
the midi-chlorians.
Thank you. Yeah, that's what it was called. And in my own work, I have a similar concept, that the character's powers are actually derived from an infection with a neurological parasite that gives her telekinetic powers. But these things go all across the board, and I don't think that most people make that. They're not capable of seeing where things are blended. They just think, oh, if it's laser beams and spaceships, then it's science fiction.
I know people that couldn't tell the difference.
Yes.
My father, it's all of those. He don't even read that stuff. Don't even want to see it. And he did read my book, though. He has read my book, so, and I like that. But he, if so, like a movie comes on, I'll say that's fantasy or science fiction. He just looks at me like, so what? Who cares?
Where's the John Wayne movie?
Yeah, where's John? He'll go for that.
You got to just ease him in with that. What was that? Cowboys from Space?
Oh my God.
Or no, Cowboys versus Aliens. Was that what it was?
Yeah, that was actually a good movie. I liked it.
Yeah, that'll be his bridge. Start off with the dude, do that one, and then just go deep with them.
As a matter of fact, I own it.
Hey, Firefly would be another good one to ease them in.
Oh,
that had a bit of a Western kind of feel.
I wish that hadn't gone off. I was really liking that series.
It's Joss Whedon's best work, so I love that series. All 13 episodes.
Well, they did wrap it up with a movie. That was good.
But that was brilliant. Just the writing was so good. My favorite part of that series was the brilliant writing. So.
Well, where do you guys think that science fiction, fantasy, and science fantasy are going to be headed in the next several years? Obviously all of us are writing in that, so we'd like to think that we could influence that genre or something, but where do you guys see?
Well, I don't want to speak for Aaron, but Aaron and I both write kind of dark stuff, and I think that there's definitely a trend toward a lot more darker stories out there than what used to be common. So that is one pathway that's happening. What's one thing that's happening, I think, in the field, whether that's not specific to science fiction or fantasy or science fantasy. That's just, I think, across the board, that people are getting more and more willing to accept more complex characters and more complex moral situations in their speculative fiction.
I agree. With how much comic book movies are prevalent now, it's very understandable for people to kind of be accepting of just an alien invasion movie or a high fantasy movie, or really anywhere in between, when they're, you go out to Avengers and you pretty much have a little bit of all of that. So it's very mainstream right now, I think, to have a blend in between science fiction and fantasy.
I think that's a good point. When I was a kid, the audience for science fiction or fantasy was very limited. I mean, it certainly wasn't the adults. You know, you go to the movie theater on a Saturday for 15 cents to see a triple feature, and it was nothing but kids in the theater. You know, and whereas today you see more. I mean, I don't know if it's because they grew up and are still watching it, or what happened, but there are more and more elderly, even elderly people like myself, that are really caught up in fantasy and science fiction. I think it provides such an escape from what's going on for real that it's something that has become kind of necessary in the current environment that we live in.
I agree. I kind of made that realization when I was, I had my wisdom teeth removed in high school, and I sat at home and I rented all the old Planet of the Apes movies on VHS. And halfway through it, I was like, this isn't just about monkeys taking over the world. This is political commentary on civil rights. And it's just abstracted enough that, you know, we're all people and we need to treat each other well. And they didn't want to come right out and say it in a very real way. They wanted people to kind of approach that idea from something that no one felt like they had to go home to. And I think that's what one of the big draws of the genre is you can tackle ideas that are just a little too touchy to, you know, maybe set it in your hometown or something. But if you put it off in space and this guy's got 4 arms and that person has tentacles, then all of a sudden you can kind of look at it more as an abstract concept rather than, you know, something you're facing going to school or work that day.
I don't think that's something new though, because old stories like THX 1138, Logan's Run, all of these dealt with present issues in society, dealing with the issues of prejudice, the issues of politics, and so on. That's always been there, and I think it always will be, because it's just going to seep in. We're the authors, and we're going to write what we know, and that's what we know.
Even Star Trek, you know, the TOS, it dealt with a lot of that stuff eloquently. And I know it had some issues because of it, but I'm glad that it endured and kept going on and on, because it was able to touch on these subjects and whatnot, and deal with, like you said, set them out in space and these different cultures. And, you know, we've gone beyond this, but these people, they're, you know, this is sort of like that. So it's like, it's reality, but it's those people over there. It's not us.
So at a safe distance where we can kind of look at it without being attached to something.
Yeah.
But I think it does, at least for some people, it gives them food for thought to look at themselves in the present and what they're like.
It also offers an opportunity for authors and readers to experience things at different levels. So on the surface, you know, like the famous Star Trek TOS episode where the one guy had like half black and half white.
Yeah.
One guy was on the left and the other one was on the right in the coloration. And the people on the ship couldn't see the difference. They were like, what, you two look exactly alike. And but the pair of them were like, no, you know, he's white on the right side and he's white on the left side and they're completely different. And it sort of like illustrated this point of, sorry.
Someone's got a buddy in the room.
He's always
Camera hard.
center of attention. But, you know, it illustrated a point, but people could view that episode at like just as a straight, like, oh, this is entertaining show, and, you know, Captain Kirk as being his usual heroic self, and yet, et cetera, et cetera. And then people who were open to seeing the deeper message could see it. And I think that's a great opportunity that speculative fiction offers us as authors, is we can explore controversial themes without and underneath the surface of telling like a rip-roaring adventure tale.
I've always considered science fiction, fantasy, and sci-fantasy to be the replacement for the no longer existing genre of satire. You know, it used to be like you had Gulliver's Travels, that was satire. And if it was in the modern world, it would be fantasy.
Right.
Yeah.
And what do you guys think about the idea that these genres are representing what used to be satire?
I think satire still exists, at least in short form, because I read a lot of it. But I agree with you that it definitely provides an opportunity to explore those issues that only used to appear in satire. So, and I don't know that there's a lot of satire in long form anymore. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I'm just missing those pieces.
Most satire I've seen has either been fantasy or science fiction, to be honest. I think one that I remember sharply was Sidney's Comet, which was written by Brian Herbert, Frank Herbert's son, and that was it was actually hilarious, but it was a satire all the way through on how things were and how people just didn't care, you know, that what they were doing was sending garbage into space, and what was happening, it was all getting collected by these aliens, and they decided to send it back as a comet. You know, so it was, but everything I've read that has been a good satire has been pretty much fantasy. Gulliver's Travels was fantasy. Moby Dick, in a way, is in a kind of a fantasy, and it really kind of talked about the human condition and how people can be obsessed.
Right.
Obsession.
Right, and the whale had mystical powers. So
yeah.
I agree with you that Moby Dick is a fantasy. I don't know how satirical it is. At least I didn't find it very funny. But...
Well, satire don't have to be funny. It can be pretty serious sometimes.
Okay, so what is your favorite mainstream sci-fantasy work that, you know, our audience would be very likely to recognize? And what work would you suggest to the audience that they really should take a look at in order to get a good grasp of science fantasy and the things that it has to offer?
Well, I'll start. I'm a big Star Wars nut. I've seen all the movies. One of the reasons that I love writing and got into it was because I had a very fun summer in between 4th and 5th grade at the Apache Junction Public Library with Star Wars novels by Timothy Zahn. So it's always stuck with me, and I've even within the last year listened to a Star Wars novel audiobook that didn't become a movie. So I guess that would be my mainstream answer. And I think that people should read the Transgressor trilogy by E.M. Swifthook to experience the science fantasy genre and see kind of where space and you know, magic and fantasy kind of merge. She's a great author that you might not have heard of.
The thing I remember the most would be Dune, the Dune series.
Yeah.
That was, I mean, that was some real far out science fiction, but it also had the fantasy elements. And if anyone that reads it, I would suggest read only the Frank Herbert novels, not his son's additions to it. They're not that good.
You know, I did like the Cymex stuff. Sorry to cut in there.
Well, I didn't like what he was doing with the books he wrote. I liked his Sidney's Comet, but I didn't like what he was doing with the Dune stuff. But the original, I don't know if it was 6, 7, or 8 novels by Frank Herbert, I thought were, I mean, I just read them almost straight through, and there was definitely science and fantasy both in there. And I think it's a good way to really see what it's all about.
Well, Amanda had mentioned Avatar earlier, and that's exceptional because, I mean, it has everything, and it would capture today's audience if they haven't seen it, and there's supposed to be another one coming out too. So I don't know, was Crow, is that considered science fantasy?
Kroll!
Yeah, that's a great movie.
Kroll earlier. That was, I could see
Yeah.
in my head, but I couldn't think of the name. Yes, Crawl.
Yes, I own that one too.
Oh, if I could have a flying Budweiser Clydesdale, my life would be complete.
It's, so many people think it's a terrible movie, but I love that movie. It is awesome.
That's a great movie.
It really is.
Did that come from a book? I would really like to read the book if it did.
That would be an interesting book.
Yeah.
Well, my answer, book-wise, would be, and it's a huge influence on me, is Anne McCaffrey's Pern series. So, and in that series, it appears first of all, there's a dragon on the cover. So, right off the bat, you think, oh, this is going to be a fantasy. But it's actually a lost space colony story where the main story takes place, I don't know, several thousand years after the original settlers on the planet, and then somehow became separated from their home world. And they ride around on dragons and have medieval level technology, but the purpose of the dragons is to shoot down this it's called thread, this stuff that floats over from a neighboring planet like once every 200 years or so, and rains down on Pern, killing everything. And the dragons are able to extinguish it with fire before it kills off stuff. So I love that series as a kid, or as a young person, as a teenager, and it was a huge influence on me. And it's, as you go along with the series, you think it's fantasy, but as you go along, all these science fiction elements come out. And Anne McCaffrey herself called the novels science fiction, not fantasy, because there's a scientific origin for everything that's happening in the books.
Yeah.
What I think people should read now, I'm probably one of the least well-read in terms of fantasy and science fiction, although that's pretty much all I write. I don't actually read that much in it, so I don't really have a good answer for that. But I read the classics, that's what I would say.
Well, I have to totally second Anne McCaffrey because actually as much as I love the Dragon Riders series, I like the, what you call it, the Ship and Hive series with Rowan and Enya and all of those. I thought that was beautifully done, the way she did those. Mm-hmm. So, I would have to recommend those as anybody who wants to get into that sci-fantasy blend. As for modern books, I do have an indie author friend who writes, it's called the Weird West sagas. And so it's like a steampunky elves, gunslingers kind of blend of a whole bunch of genres that I think falls very nicely into science fantasy. And I would recommend those for particularly people who aren't as big into the dragons and wizards kind of thing, because it's definitely a very Western feel to it.
That Weird West sounds like it'd be good for anyone who has a hole in their heart, like I do, for finishing the Dark Tower series and needing more gunslinging action.
I didn't say something modern, so I'm going to jump in there and point out a duology that I'm currently reading by Aaron Michael Hall, The Rites of Erdron, and I am just about finished with the first book, and we'll be going on to the second one. But that is definitely science fantasy.
Okay, well, do any of you guys have anything else that you would like to touch on with this particular topic?
Yeah, you know what? I did want to mention one thing. I think that no matter what sort of fantastical elements that we decide to put in a story, what can kind of draw somebody in is being able to connect with reality in some way. Whether, for myself, I trained in martial arts for years before I started writing, so I like to spend a lot of time on fight scenes and describe them fluidly, but also very accurately. So I think no matter how we're spinning it, getting people in touch with reality at the same time is great. And when I mentioned Transgressor Trilogy, one thing I really like about Swifthook is that the depth of her character interactions and the way they talk to one another and are, you know, approaching one another, and they at first they're all kind of afraid of being betrayed by one another. So it's this interpersonal drama that anyone can relate to that's been in, you know, a close relationship with somebody. So it's like, yes, spaceships are crashing and this kind of post-colonial space society is, you know, reverted to very, very hard times. But it's like, no, these people are still treating one another like humans do. So you can kind of buy in and go along with it. I think that's the key element in any sort of speculative fiction.
Totally. I completely agree. I think your characters are, you really should be, you know, character and plot go hand in hand, and you need to make both of them believable. And when you're writing fantasy, your world has to work, and it needs to be consistent within itself, and the plot needs to be plausible within the world that you create. But at the same time, I think it's even more important that your characters be as much like real human beings as you can possibly make them. Flaws, you know, character quirks, whatever it is, and that's vital for making readers be able to identify with the characters and then care about them, so that they follow them through the whole story.
We were talking about that last night, and you could have, you know, the coolest tech around and all these fantastical elements, and if the characters are flat and, you know, are, you know, obtuse, and, you know, no one's going to care about them, and they're not, you know, it doesn't matter what you have. So that's something that I know most of the authors that I know spend a lot of time developing the characters and the relationships and the dialogue between them and building that up, because even in the best fantasy, it has to be rooted in reality to make the connection. So, I mean, characterization is extremely important. And if I can't connect to that character, I'm not connected to that book.
Yes.
So,
Yeah.
Completely.
All right. Well, it sounds like we're about done. So I'm going to have everybody go through and reiterate what your book is, and, you know, some places where they can find it and find you and catch up with your books.
You can find information about me and everything that I'm writing on tomfolwell.com. If you put Tom Folwell in Google, you'll find me. There's 3 Tom Folwells in the world, and I'm the only one writing stories. So that'll come right up on top. And I'm writing, so far I've written most just fantasy. I've got a trilogy and another single book, and I am working on another fantasy with Erin, and called Corintor Liusi. She says it so much better, but that's going to be, I think, the best book yet. So
I write, of course, like I said, epic fantasy and science fantasy. I have one epic fantasy trilogy out now. It's the Rise of Nazil trilogy, and the Rise of Nazil, Seed of Scorn, and Pierce in the Darkness. And I have a science fantasy duology out, which is Rites of Erdogan and Orbs of Trinity, and an audiobook with that. And working on Corintor Liusi with Tom Folwell, which will be out next year. And my second trilogy and my epic fantasy will start releasing next year too. And you can find all that on Amazon or at erinmichaelhall.com.
My name is Amanda Justice, but I write under AM Justice. I have one novel currently available called Wizard's Forge. And you can find information about my work at amjusticeauthor.com.
And I'm Shane Thomas. I wrote the Anki Legacies Adventures, still am. You can check me out at larc-sci-fi.com. That's larc-sci-fi.com. Sign up for my mail list. I also do book reviews of science fantasy as well as science fiction and fantasy and a little bit of action. That's larc-sci-fi.com. Thanks, everybody.
And I have been your host, Sarah Buhrman. I am the author of the Runespells series. Too Weird has been out for about a year, and Fluffy Bunny is being released later this year. So look out for that. You can find me under AuthorGoddess as the website or the Twitter handle, or under Sarah Buhrman on Facebook. Thanks to all of our audience for listening in. Thank you to all of our wonderful authors for doing this today. It's been a great conversation. Don't forget to check out all of our booths at the Virtual FantasyCon 2017. Links will be posted below, so keep an eye out and enjoy our new authors and check out these books.
Bye, everybody.